might have been able to notice that I actually cut a little bit of the darker ones out because they were behind these. So that is, my bearings again, the simple draw order. Now, fade out radius. You already saw that a little bit when I had to enable this or add a bit of a radius so we could see anything at all. If I was to take these way back down, say about 10, notice how they start to fade out. Let me set this to about 30. Just give a very tight radius. And notice how as I move the view really close, alright, I'll have to up that some more. 100, 200. So as I get closer, you can see, now this is a very pronounced effect because I've got the radius set so low, but as I get closer, the mesh fades in, and as I get pulled away from it, it fades back. And of course, you'd make that a lot larger for actual gameplay, but that's just the principle of making it so that the decorations way off in the distance won't draw and won't eat up processing time. Let me up that so it's a little bit more visible in the distance. So that's fade out radius. Now, lit directional. What lit directional will do is actually add some shading. You notice even if a decoration was picking up the shadowing from the terrain, it was still a uniform shading for the entire static mesh. If you turn decoration, if you turn lit directional to 1, they're now based off the direction of the light. Now, this sometimes can act a little funny, as you can see here, but generally what this is for, maybe if I turn off disregard lighting. But generally what this is for is it in most cases will give a fading effect where the side of the decoration closer to the sunlight will be brighter and then it will fade to darker. Let me turn this back to 0, lit directional back to 1. Generally, as long as you have smooth shadows, it usually looks best with lit directional off. But again, just something to play with depending on your map's lighting. Now, max per quad. Now you notice we have the ability to up the density multiplier, but you can only get that effect so high with only one mesh per quad. But using max per quad, you can allow more. That's more per face on the terrain. So in this case, in some of the tighter areas, multiple static meshes were being assigned as decorations to every single quad. And of course, you could really bog down gameplay by turning that way up. It's kind of fun just for playing around with to add a nice field of grass. Random yaw, what that will do is, let me actually real quick just grab a different static mesh to point this one out. Under static meshes, let me grab lamppost and assign that instead of the grass. Other than being kind of interesting to be able to paint lampposts, notice how they're all oriented the same way. If you're trying to distribute some uniform mesh but make it look a little bit more random on the mesh, you can use random yaw. By activating that, you'll notice that they now have a random rotation. So very simple, but a very nice way of scattering a more technical looking mesh. Turn that back off. And scale map. You saw before when we had the different colored grass that we actually use that color to specify the scale. This would be simply if you wanted to assign a different scale map through the properties. Now, scale multiplier. This is kind of interesting. If, say, for example, you didn't want to go back and retweak your original colors, or you simply wanted more of an effect on a certain axis, you can load up the scale multiplier and set a minimum and maximum scale. 1 and 1 means that all the meshes will be uniform. That is based off of what scale map. Now, you don't even need a scale map to use this, but it would still be in effect if you had. Since we're not using a scale map on the light posts, we can basically assign it using the min and max. If we were to take the min down to like 0.5, some of the meshes are now half size. Notice we have a little bit of fading because I turned on the fade out radius or lowered the min radius. But now we have varying heights, and the maximum we could set that above 1, maybe even 2, so they're a lot taller. So they can go anywhere from 0.5 to twice as high as normal. So you can adjust the multiplier, and again, in all 3 axes. So you can close that up. Seed, what this is you'll notice that static meshes get placed randomly. Even if you paint a density map, it's still random placement based on the max density between density multiplier and max per quad. And if you don't like how the random placement ended up, you can always just change the seed. This is basically just the initial randomization number, if you will. So as we change that, we just get totally different randomizations of placement. So if you need to do some tweaking or just don't like the way the meshes ended up, you can always just play around with different seeds. Show on invisible terrain. Let me go and actually, I would need to paint a little bit more. Basically what this means is there's still terrain in this area where we cut through, and if show on invisible terrain was turned on, it would actually show on parts that we had painted out with the visibility tool. Show on terrain is simply whether or not this decal layer shows at all. If we turn show on terrain to 0, we don't see the decal layer. If we turn it back on, it reappears. It's nice for when testing the map if you simply want to take the decal layer out temporarily to tweak other things. And finally, static mesh. As you saw just a second ago, I could assign different static meshes at will, and that's also available within texture editing, so whichever is closer. If you're messing around in the properties, you can just grab the static mesh from here. And that should pretty much cover most of what you'd want to go through inside of decal layers. Finally, we have layers themselves. And inside the layers we're currently using, we have stuff like the alpha map. Again, if you have a custom alpha map you want to use. And then you have the layer rotation. That's a good point. I guess I need to go ahead real quick before we wrap this up and show the different rotation ability inside the editing dialog. And real quick, just throwing this in, say we wanted to grab the overall texture that belonged to a certain layer. Remember in the first lesson, or the second lesson, we didn't go through the texture, pan, rotate, and scale? That's because they apply to layers. Now that we have some layers, let me go ahead and grab one of them. And with that layer selected, if I grab texture pan and control left or right drag, you can see I can pan the texture over the surface. So if you simply have different points where you want the texture to align, you can grab pan and pan it up until it matches up. Texture rotate will grab the entire texture and actually rotate a little bit. So if you want to add an angle, like a 45-degree angle, just drag it until it looks about like that. And finally, texture scale. If initially you didn't have the U-pan and V-pan set up the way you want, you can grab texture scale and scale the texture out in U or V, and actually add a stretched look or pull it back in, or however you need to adjust the texture. So that's probably the easiest method of editing textures, because it's visual. You can drag it around in the viewport. But again, if you need to, you can always go and grab train info for one last time. Underneath layers, this is where those layers actually play into effect. You can go in. Well, actually, it's probably more of it's a separate offset. If we add like 2000, of course I'm editing this one over here, but just an extra layer of control for the layer's rotation, the texture that it's currently using, and texture map axis. If you had, let me see if I can find one against the wall here. Basically, it'll project, like right now it's projecting on the XY, so basically projecting from straight down onto it. If most of your terrain was at an angle, you could try projecting from a different axis, like for example projecting onto the side of a mountain. Generally though, you'll use XY because most of the textures lay out flat across the terrain. After that we have some more rotation and the initial U scale and V scale. If you had better numbers in mind and didn't want to play around with the scaling inside the editing dialog, got a few numbers down here. So with that should pretty much cover the properties. It's kind of tedious, but it's nice to know what some of these do, because there's a whole lot of tweaking that can be done at the properties level.
Very cool.
So with that should pretty much wrap it up, and that should most definitely get you started on how to work with and then go back and edit and add to terrain.
Absolutely. Fantastic job, Logan. Fantastic. All right, well, that's going to conclude this lesson on terrain. Thanks a lot, everyone. Take care.